This is Thinking in Public, a program dedicated to intelligent conversation about frontline theological and cultural issues with the people who are shaping them. I'm Albert Mohler, your host and president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Benjamin Lipscomb is professor of philosophy at Houghton University. He earned his PhD from the University of Notre Dame. He is an accomplished scholar and author who specializes in contemporary ethical theory and the history of philosophy with a particular focus on issues of character formation. His recent book, The Women Are Up to Something, tells the story of 4 women who reshaped ethics and philosophy in the 20th century. And that book is the topic of our conversation today. Professor Lipscomb, welcome to Thinking in Public.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, I have to say, I think your book title is one of the very best of any recent release, certainly in the field of intellectual history and philosophy. You entitled the book, The Women Are Up to Something. So first of all, who are they and what in the world are they up to?
I should give credit to my acquaintance at the University of Chicago, Candace Vogler, who said, this is what your title should be. But I love it too. The women are Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Mary Midgley, and Iris Murdoch, who all meet up at Oxford right at the beginning of the Second World War. They're born right after the First World War, and this sets them up to be about 18, about when war is breaking out again. And they cross paths there under really unusual circumstances when the men have volunteered or been conscripted away, and suddenly the character of the university changes overnight, and they get a kind of mentoring and encouragement. Possibilities open up for them that I think it's reasonable to say wouldn't have if it had been 5 years earlier even.
Yeah, it is a fascinating moment in history. I think it's great to kind of lay the historical foundations for an intellectual development here. So you're talking about colleges, and in particular residential colleges in the Oxbridge system, and in particular at Oxford. And it had not been that long since women were denied even admission to those colleges.
Right. There had been women's colleges since the late 19th century. I think 1870, I'm going to get the date wrong, 1879-ish, when Somerville and Lady Margaret Hall opened the first of these women's societies. But no degrees can be granted until 1919. It's right after the First World War when I think in acknowledgement of all the things women had been doing in British society, it felt too absurd to go on denying them the right to degrees.
Right.
Though I have to then say Cambridge didn't begin granting women degrees until the late 1940s. But they are
Harvard University, very close to that, by the way.
Yeah. And they understand themselves to be on probation. And there's a moment in the book where I quote one of the officers of Somerville College, where 3 of the 4 of these women went, saying, you need to understand the women are on probation at this university, that you might think you just act for yourself, but in fact, everyone's looking at you. Everyone's making judgment about women at Oxford. This isn't a settled thing, though we wish it were.
Yeah, you know, in terms of the historical chronology here, World War I was not just an occasion for women to be unusually integrated into the economy, especially there in Britain, and into vocational life. It also represented a death toll among young men that was one of the first in human history and one of the last to have been so disproportionately lethal to the elite. And so, you know, you think about Harrow, Eton, Oxford, Cambridge, and the other most elite schools. The death toll of the officer class in World War I was so horrifying that it wasn't just that men went off to war, it's that so many of them never came home.
Yeah, it's true. It's talked about sometimes as a lost generation. The point can be overstated I did a little calculation on the back of an envelope when I was asking, okay, all of these women had officers for fathers. How likely is it that all of their fathers would have come home? And the odds were about even. But still, 17% of your officer class is a devastating toll. And it was very unevenly distributed. The story has been told many times of how whole communities would send off their men together. And thinking of morale, the British Army allowed these villages to serve together. And so if there was a devastating attack, a whole village could lose its entire young men.
Yeah. Just horrifying. And then this strange interregnum between the wars. And then, as we are reminded in Abraham Lincoln's language, war came. In this case, the Second World War.
Yeah.
And as it came, once again, Oxford and Cambridge were basically emptied out of not only, by the way, many students, but many professors as well, drawn into the military intelligence and other defense apparatus.
Classics, it turned out, was, wouldn't necessarily suppose this, but a field that lended itself well to reapplication in military intelligence. There's a great biography that I'm anticipating coming out before too long of J.L. Austin, very famous classics and philosophy professor at Oxford, who spends his whole war up in Bletchley Park doing code breaking.
That afforded the colleges an opportunity, but also it was a tremendous challenge because there really was a sense in which it was hard to imagine how some of those residential colleges could continue during the war. And so how did that happen? I mean, in fact, one of the big issues, I was at Oxford as studying in 1986, and, there were still people there then who were quite aware of the deprivations during the war when it often seemed unlikely that some of this could continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How did they continue at all? Well, I mean, these are places, the men's colleges particularly, that have some accumulated means and can weather a storm. But another thing to emphasize here is the government was allowing some officers and others to go through, particularly on short courses. And so the traditional population of men is gone, but there's also these sort of RAF cadres coming through for little targeted short courses and then right off again.
And casualties.
Yeah.
Men who had been wounded would find their way eventually back to the universities.
Yes. The wounded, the conscientious objectors, the ordnance, anybody who is going through a course judged of special strategic importance, people on short courses bound for the officer corps, this odd collection of men. But suddenly, particularly in longer courses like the classics philosophy curriculum, which takes 4 years, that it's kind of just the women who are left.
Right. And they were up to something.
Yes.
So kind of take us into that. So why was philosophy in this particular time for this generation of young women such an attractive intellectual discipline?
It didn't have to be. That's the first thing to say, that the dominant school of philosophy at this time, what philosophy meant popularly and in many circles within the academy, was the positivism of A.J. Ayer, a view that all there is the deliverances of the hard sciences, and if philosophy is for anything, it's just for cleaning up the language with which we express logical and scientific
establishing rules.
Truths. Yeah. And the title of Ayer's book is really telling here. Language, truth, and logic. We're going to analyze language so as to articulate very plain, humdrum scientific truths and logical principles, and that's it. As Frank Ramsey said, ethics was judged to be a subject without an object. And so the political questions that are so hot and pressing for people who are themselves having to decide what to do about Hitler, who had to decide a few years before that what to do about Franco in Spain, and whose peers are making these same decisions. Politics is so consuming a concern, and philosophy is turned clean away from it. I think that it's a testament to the power and example that a mentor can have, that these four go into philosophy. I will make an immediate exception for Elizabeth Anscombe, who converts to Catholicism at age 15 over the objections to the horror of her family, and she was going to be a philosopher no matter what. But the other three, it's their theologian philosopher tutor, Donald MacKinnon, who swims against the current, who thinks unfashionable thoughts, who remains interested in understanding evil in the world and in thinking metaphysically in a way that you were not supposed to do if you were a fashionable philosopher at that time. And they come under MacKinnon's tutelage, and this is redirecting for them.
Yeah, this generalization is sometimes Oxford and Cambridge, but the two have very different personalities.
Yeah.
And Oxford in particular with analytic philosophy, or analytical philosophy, depending on which side of the pond you may be on.
Yeah.
But also just, it was not just philosophy, it was also law. I think of H.L.A. Hart and others who held to such a positivist understanding of law, and an absolute division between the law and morality, just stating that the law makes absolutely no moral claims and is based upon no morality. It's just it's like a game of rules. These are the rules, but no one's claiming they comport to or correspond to a moral reality. Analytical philosophy, very similar in terms of, and you mentioned air. I mean, again, there is no objective truth to be known unless it's a mathematical formula.
Right. Ethics is a matter of expressing what side we're on practical matters, cheering or booing with respect to what we see happening in the world, what we fear or hope will happen in the world. It's not something that can be assessed as more or less accurate, more or less correct. There's no answerability to the world or to truth there.
So let's put that in context before we turn to the women who are up to something.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to imagine a period in modern history, let's just say, the last 300 years. It's just hard to imagine a moment in which it was less sustainable to argue that ethics has no content than in the period between the two world wars.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about this. An early reviewer of the book, Cheryl Mijak, said in her review, well, obviously, R.M. Hare, Richard Hare, who becomes the kind of professional antagonist to these four women as they are trying to articulate to themselves and to others what moral truth could be like, how we could make sense of that. Hare has this enormous following, and he himself has been through horrors as a prisoner of war in Burma. So it's got to be that there's some existential pull to this ethics is unreal kind of position. And I think I talk about this in the book, there is a kind of attraction to the idea of facing down the bleakness of it all and being brave enough, what's the word I want? Unconsoled enough to see things the hard and horrible way they are and face them. And so I think maybe especially for a prisoner of war who'd been through it, to say, yes, none of this is real. All we have is the stake we turn in the ground. There is nothing but ourselves and the commitments we band together around. There's something at some level really unsatisfying about that. But I've been trying in charity to say, what's the attraction there? I think maybe that's something like it.
Yeah, it's just interesting to look in contrast at the world of theology at the time. Because, the big movement gaining ground between the two wars, and especially on the continent, is neo-orthodoxy. And neo-orthodoxy is rejecting the optimism, the moral optimism of liberalism because of the killing fields of World War I. Yeah. It's really interesting that at the same time, in contrast, philosophy is kind of giving up on value judgments.
Yeah. And it starts early in the interwar period. I'm sure you've read Lewis's The Abolition of Man, where he talks about this sort of upper forms language arts textbook that is making these sorts of claims that any judgment of value is just a kind of expression of preference.
Men without chess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, without the moral capacity, but he was using an odd physiology to make that point. They have hearts and they feel, and they have minds, they think, but nothing to relate the two.
Yeah.
All right. So these women end up and among many. So you have four very influential women, each of whom, but not equally, became famous in the field of philosophy. I think of Iris Murdoch. I think most people would think of her as a novelist,
Right.
not as a philosopher. But then again, if you read her novels, as I have, there's an incredible background of philosophical sophistication in them.
Yeah, it's interesting to read her interviews where she talks about her novels and denies vehemently that they're expressions of her philosophy. And I guess I can take her point. They're not didactic novels.
Right.
They're not like, I mean, thank goodness, they're not like the novels of Ayn Rand, where you have these characters making great speeches, which are obviously self-inserts for the author.
Right.
But they are full of her reflection on philosophical themes, and you can trace all sorts of connections to the things she's puzzling through. But she is a very influential essayist. There's a book that came out, I want to say about 10 years ago by Justin Brooks from Brown University, an edited collection, Iris Murdoch, Philosopher, in which people, including some people like Charles Taylor, enormously famous, talk about what a difference Iris Murdoch's few little collections of essays made in shaping and redirecting their thought. What she's wonderful at is imaginative recasting, getting people to approach a whole set of questions in a new way.
Yeah, even her novels, I simply have to say. My first thought when I read the very first of her novels is, it's hard to imagine a group of this many different characters who think this deeply about things. So,
yeah, they all kind of like people who went to university together, going on having the conversations they were having at Oxford.
Amazingly enough, yeah. And by the way, again, one of the most influential literary figures of the 20th century. So, in other words, what she did extremely well.
Yes.
Okay, so these women end up, and I want you to tell the story of their relationships, and so how did they end up at Oxford, and how do they end up being discussed together?
Okay. They end up at Oxford by different paths. I don't know how much you want me to fragment this, but Midgley comes from a family where education was an expected thing for the daughters. And so she's just looking at her options from a quite excellent girls' school downhouse from early on. It's never a question whether she's going to go to university. Similarly, for Elizabeth Anscombe, whose parents were both school teachers and definitely wanted education for their children. But Iris Murdoch, it's a bit of a reach. Her parents had not been to university, and they were upwardly mobile in thinking about getting their daughter into a good preparatory school and then encouraging her to consider this. And Philippa Foot is my favorite story here. She's the granddaughter of a U.S. president, Grover Cleveland. Her mother was the last baby born in the White House, I think, in the White House, literally delivered there. And her mother is married to the younger son of a British aristocrat. And so she's raised by governesses up in North Yorkshire. And higher schooling is very much not what people in her set wanted for their daughters.
Right. Explain that. But I interrupted you there, and because that is so counterintuitive. It's just like the use of the word middle class when we speak about Britain is so generally misunderstood by Americans. But when you're looking at the lower aristocracy, not to mention the higher, but the lower aristocracy, the thought of sending their daughters to university was just absolutely foreign.
Yeah, it's not respectable that they were to circulate in the county set of dignified, distinguished people, take their place as society hostesses and people of distinction who are a bit above it all. And the idea of getting trained to go and do something economically productive, it's beneath them. And so there's a wonderful story that I had from Peter Conradi, Iris Murdoch's biographer, who also knew Philippa Foot quite well, of the time when Foot had been told by a governess, you really could go to university. And Foot was already quietly within herself rebelling against the life that she was leading at home. And she was very interested in this. set her heart on it. To their credit, her parents did not resist her, but she did have this story of a friend of her mother's saying to her, um, "Don't worry, dear," because her mother was fretting about her daughter doing something so common. "Don't worry, dear. She doesn't look clever." So
Yeah.
at least she looked still distinguished and elegant
Yeah.
and like she hadn't mucked around in
Yeah.
education.
Yeah, well, I mean, it does tell you something about the some of the stereotypes that were also established by class very rigidly. You know,
Yes.
for instance, in the United States, there's some good works on higher education that point out that one of the reasons why the upper middle class in the United States, why those parents often did not want their daughters going to college or university is that the academic setting would include young men they did not consider suitable. That they could basically arrange a much tighter class association. But once you got to the university, it was doors are wide open.
Oh, that's fascinating. It's filling me with all kinds of thoughts about the present day situation in which the number of women going to university
Right.
in the States is much greater than men and the trouble this makes for marriage. But that would be
Absolutely.
a distraction.
Yeah. No, but it does tell us that, I mean, we take for granted right now. And by the way, there are some very deep educational and sociological concerns about the pattern right now. And
Yeah.
it's not that there are too many young women in higher education, there are too few young men.
Right.
But nonetheless, I think it's important for us to recognize in the span of human history, even in what we would call higher education, the widespread admission of many women into graduate programs is actually a fairly recent development.
Yeah. And very unevenly distributed among different disciplines.
Right.
But there's still a lot of talk about this, and rightly so. In philosophy, I mean, I teach upper level philosophy courses. I've been doing it for 20 years, and the women I teach are terrific. And actually, a number of them have gone on to graduate work. And yet you look at the profession as a whole, and it's pretty tilted. Is this about a kind of socially constructed or more deeply rooted disparity of interests? Doesn't seem to me that as I teach them, but yes, some fields you've got a lot more equal balance or tipping the other way.
So the four women were indicative of a larger group of women
Yeah.
who both seized and saw the opportunity to
Yes.
pursue what was not only an opportunity for them to study, but also a sense of responsibility that these were fields that needed work, and they had something to contribute. And so they enter into the academic study of philosophy. And you mentioned positivism. I mean, at a particularly sterile time in the philosophical academy in the English-speaking world.
Yeah. They love the ideas that, and I'm again needing to say, I'm talking about the three who study with Donald McKinnon.
Right.
Elizabeth Anscombe, when you've got a kid who starts reading 19th century natural theology textbooks in her teenage years and picking apart arguments for God's existence to see how they can be made better, that kid's going into
Right.
philosophy no matter what anybody does or says.
Yes. Whether there's a degree involved, you have a
No.
philosopher on your hands.
But the other three, it's the intensity of McKinnon's determination to understand the evil overtaking the world and to create language in which to talk about this comprehendingly and to think how to address it. I think they are captivated a little bit like Plato is captivated by Socrates, by the example of this person thinking out loud in front of them. And they think that is important. Those questions are important. I don't think at the first they have some mission to transform a discipline. That happens. This is a little bit of a distraction, but I think it's relevant. I was teaching today about Saint Benedict in the early medieval period. He doesn't set out to preserve literacy in the West. He doesn't set out to create these islands of order in a sea of chaos. He does that by accident. And I think something similar is true here, that they are gripped by these questions. They are determined to go on thinking about these things if they can be allowed to and can make enough money to support themselves doing it. But they have certain preoccupations which then answer to the needs of the philosophical community and of a wider community in that moment. And above all, they become determined, like their mentor, to find something more satisfying, more instructive to say about evil. in the face of the Holocaust, in the face of the bombs, in the face of political tumult of all sorts. They want a better vocabulary, a better conceptual vocabulary in which to talk about this. Philippa Foot exemplifies this. She goes and sees the first films coming out of Buchenwald and is just shocked to her core by this, and goes and talks to Mackinnon, says to him, "Nothing can ever be the same now, can it?" And she said to her, "No, nothing can ever be the same." But from that moment, she doesn't see how right away. None of them do. But they go in with this intuition: Ayer has to be wrong. We've got to figure out how.
There has to be moral. There has to be content to morality.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be some way of expressing truth in moral terms.
Yes, there has to be something
and it starts
better
with
to
evil.
say than that Hitler had different sentiments than we do.
Right. Yeah, I think it's, and I'm a theologian. By the way, I appreciate the fact Mackinnon's both a philosopher and a theologian. Yeah. And as a theologian, I have to say, it is really interesting that our attention is so often directed in a way that can be described as moral realism, not by the good, but by the evil. In other words, it's evil that requires an explanation, and evil on a scale of the Holocaust, Nazi Germany, and frankly, other developments at the same time. Evil focuses the mind in a way that otherwise the mind might never focus.
Yeah, I want to think about that. There's something to that.
Well, theodicy has been the driving issue of much theological, even changes in theological method over the course of the 20th century. Even, of course, you can go back to Leibniz and go back to the 19th century. But in the 20th century, human evil on a scale that human beings had never imagined before. It's the one reality every theology, every philosophical tool, it has to address itself to that evil.
Yeah. What's the Latin phrase? Unde hoc malum? Whence this evil? Why is it like this?
Yeah. Okay, so the four women that you cover, and three of them study with Mackinnon, Philippa Foot separately. I'm kind of tempted here to say, let's talk about the three for a moment. And the influence of, but I want you to tell the narrative the way you want to lay it out. In other words, how did they find each other, and what drew the four of them together?
Okay, they find each other because Oxford is a small place and there's fewer people there, especially in upper level philosophy lecture halls. Right. Murdoch and Midgley start together.
They become more than close friends. I mean, there's a camaraderie here that's very deep.
And it's kind of pairwise. That Murdoch and Midgley start at Somerville College together in the same year, and they're both doing classics, which is the principal way that you study philosophy at Oxford at this time. You do ancient history and ancient philosophy and then modern philosophy in this kind of strange but very instructive and fruitful hybrid program. And so they are going through all the same lectures together, going to the same tutorials, going through the curriculum side by side, and form a tight friendship that way. Murdoch ends up being the maid of honor in Midgley's wedding a decade later. Foot and Murdoch become acquainted with one another really only at the end of their undergraduate years, but quickly form a tight bond and end up rooming together during the war when they're both doing war work in London, and form this tight lifelong friendship. Foot is one of the people who's nursing Murdoch, or I should say, giving compassionate leave to her husband when Murdoch is descending into Alzheimer's at the end of her life. And Midgley and Foot know one another as people who are just at Somerville together. They're always sort of casual university friends. I wouldn't say the two of them are ever particularly tight. And then Anscombe becomes especially close with Foot when they're colleagues together at Somerville. Anscombe has gone to St. Hugh's College, but ends up being hired on in a research position, and Foot joins the faculty at Somerville, and they go through most of 2 decades side by side as the philosophy team at this small but extremely distinguished women's college. And every afternoon talk philosophy until it's time to go home for supper.
Yeah, what a life. It is a different mode of existence. And
yes,
parts of it survive in
Yes.
academic life today, but only parts.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's talk the content of their intellectual contribution. So
Yes.
what sets them apart, or to ask it again, what exactly were they up to?
Okay. Yeah. I'm hesitant to
Yeah,
use the word school. And some reviewers have said, were they really a school? I think I quote one person saying that in the
yeah,
preface, and it's become a theme in reviews. I am uncommitted on how school-like to make them. They
yeah.
certainly didn't have a sense of themselves like the Frankfurt School, uh, that they
Right,
have this mission
right.
that they can write a manifesto
They also
about.
weren't trying to change the world tomorrow.
No, but they build on one another's work. All of them, in each of them in her own way, is set against Ayer's vision, in which there's no moral truth. And they prod and prompt one another toward, I'm going to use the term ethical naturalism, and that could be misleading because it could suggest a kind of fully secular view. For some of them it was, and for some of them it wasn't. But what I mean is that ethics is to be understood as, for human beings, grounded in facts about our created nature. I'm putting it Christianly here, our created nature. But if you didn't believe in creation, you just talk about our nature. And they are reaching back for and trying to repristinate the views of Aristotle and Aquinas, these great pre-modern moral thinkers who think in terms of virtues and vices, who think in terms of the qualities, the traits that help us to live a rich, flourishing life as the kind of creatures we are, doing the kinds of things that we characteristically do as members of our species. The vices are the traits that get in the way. The virtues are the ones that facilitate human life. And there can be more to say to that than that, particularly for a Christian who thinks that faith, hope, and love are the virtues beyond the virtues. But nonetheless, base level is to understand that there's such a thing as succeeding or failing at what human beings are designed to do. And we can, by recovering that vocabulary, we can help people to see how it could be not absurd to relate
Right.
values to facts.
Not absurd.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that that is the intellectual leap that must be made just tells us a great deal about the sterility of analytical philosophy. And frankly, it was not equal, but it was present on both sides of the Atlantic. So,
Yeah.
Let me ask you, is there any analogy to these four women in terms of American intellectual life?
I'm not aware of a cluster in the same way of people who go to work on responding to positivism and build off of one another. Really, I think of the rejection of positivist ethics in the United States as coming with John Rawls around 1970, when just he makes a clean break and says, look, we've had a civil rights movement, we've had an anti-war movement, we've been trying to figure out who to allocate dialysis machines to. Let's just talk about justice again as if none of this ever happened, instead of really trying to build a new foundation for talking about ethics.
Yeah, I was thinking along some of the same lines. In the United States, by the way, as you know, the university culture was not altered to the same degree as was
Right.
true in the British Isles.
Right.
For one thing, Roosevelt and the American military elite saw the continuation of the universities as necessary for the war effort.
Mm.
And so it was, I mean, clearly millions of young men were conscripted and as well as volunteered, but conscripted and sent to war. But a significant number were considered to be necessary for scientific, especially scientific and technological research. And so portions of the American universities actually thrived, whereas in Great Britain, the intellectual class in the military culture there is separated from the universities into kind of what you call military think tanks, like Bletchley Park.
Yeah, there's a special burden of justification over there, akin to the burden of justification that was put on travel. Is your journey really necessary? These signs hang up everywhere.
Right.
And you get educated if there was some special reason to keep educating you, or if it wasn't getting in the way.
Right. And again, World War I was experienced so differently on the two sides of the Atlantic. And the Americans got there so late, experienced nothing of the megadeath, as Hobsbawm called it.
Or the sense of existential threat. You're on this little island and the Germans are right there.
Right. You know, when people hear the name Elizabeth Anscombe, when evangelical Christians hear that name, you know exactly where they go. The one thing they know about Elizabeth Anscombe is that not only did she enter into a famous debate with C.S. Lewis, but even C.S. Lewis believed that she defeated him. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think, you know, again, evangelicals, I know that name. Now, I think they may also know that name for some other reasons having to do with such things as euthanasia more recently.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But let's come back to C.S. Lewis for a moment.
Sure.
So how exactly did that happen, and why was it so devastating to C.S. Lewis himself by his own perception?
Okay. How it happens is Lewis is the faculty advisor to this group that had been around since these women's undergraduate days, the Socratic Club, which is a wonderful organization. Lewis and some students and a chaplain pull this together because they feel rightly, like serious theological exploration has not found as much of a place, as much of a forum as it should have at a university like Oxford. And so they start sponsoring conversations that are often conversations between believers and unbelievers.
Right.
And it's this incredibly rich, fertile context. And all four of the women I write about were interested in, sometimes engaged with the Socratic. Elizabeth Anscombe is dragged into, she'd been an attendee and she really liked how they did business. She loved how they would carry a conversation over from one session to the other. She's so serious about the life of the mind. But she was very shy about public speaking in the early phases of her career, which is surprising given how pugnacious she could be. But she didn't seek out these opportunities, but she was coaxed into giving a response to a chapter from Lewis's book on miracles, in which he said that naturalism, in a different sense than I've been using it, is self-contradictory, is self-defeating. And what happens, without getting deeply into the weeds here, is that Anscombe is one of the best analytic philosophers of the century and finds some genuine technical problems with what Lewis had thought was this airtight little argument that you couldn't possibly assert an evolutionary origin to human thought processes. Al Plantinga has made an argument like this in recent years, acknowledging and taking account of Anscombe's criticisms. But Lewis isn't ready for them. He was a philosopher as an undergraduate, and he's a first-rate mind, but his professional specialty is literary theory, and Anscombe is operating on a next level in terms of this kind of digging in to implications. And he sees it. It's a little bit like Salieri being able to appreciate Mozart. I don't like that comparison because Lewis is greater than that. But that experience of being able to perceive that something is so, but not being able to match it yourself. And he was really deeply embarrassed by this, but had the honesty and the humility that he reached out to Anscombe, or rather, he reached out to one of his fellow officers at the Socratic and said, I think we need her to be our next president. If she's defeated me as an apologist, then she should take over. And I think that's a really impressive moment. And Anscombe noticed this about him, noticed how he revised the chapter when the second edition of Miracles came out and said, that's a serious person.
And when he wrote The Problem of Pain, wrote in a very different light.
Yes.
About that for a moment. As a theologian, I often find C.S. Lewis very wanting. In other words, there's a problem in intellectual categories when you just assume that someone who's absolutely brilliant in for instance, English literature or even medieval English literature, which there is no greater mind, frankly, unless it was his colleague and friend J.R.R. Tolkien. In other words, it's just not translatable necessarily into being a first-rate debater in another field. And so, again, I have great appreciation for C.S. Lewis. I find him theologically wanting. But at the same time, he is the most effective communicator on behalf of classical theism in the 20th century. And you mentioned Plantinga. I think Plantinga far more sophisticated, both philosophically and theologically, and far more influential in the academy, but nowhere. I mean, people, as much as you admire Plantinga, he's not spoken of like C.S. Lewis, nor did he write, by the way, science fiction novels for children.
No, he did not. But I want to sort of drive home one lesson about what this shows about Anscombe, because I think it's a lesson for Christians in their intellectual pursuits. Anscombe was asked by her daughter once. Her daughter records the story, asking about this debate and, why did you go after him that way, Mama? And she said, well, look, we have this duty to the truth. And I take it behind that remark is that Jesus Christ is the truth. Yes. That we've got this duty to the truth, that we don't let bad arguments stand even in a good cause. And she was about following the truth fearlessly wherever that led her.
And by the way, I was as confused as her daughter at one point as a college student, as I'm trying to come to terms. So I was, as a young evangelical Christian, reading about that exchange in a biography of Lewis. I assumed then that Anscombe is not a believer. No. I assume that Anscombe was writing, because I will fault the biographer somewhat, because it's as if, Anscombe is writing simply as an analytic philosopher and basically, another, A.J. Ayer or Anthony Flew. And that's hardly the case,
No. Yeah. But it bugs her that he's glib and sloppy as she sees it. And she wants to say these arguments don't work. And like Augustine says something like this. He says, don't give bad arguments for the truths of the faith, because people will think that those are the arguments you've got. Right.
Yeah, something about Elizabeth Anscombe that I just want to mention is that her role right now in terms of British public life is largely due to her defense of human dignity and some very prescient work that she did, basically on the sanctity of life against the threats of such things as euthanasia and the idea that human life has reached its meaningful end before its physical end.
Yeah, that's right. The whole second half of her career, or arguably her whole career long, my friend at the University of Toronto, a theologian philosopher there, John Berkman, is working a lot on this. She's concerned with the loss of the concept of murder in the late modern world. And she thinks about it in context of abortion, thinks about it in context of euthanasia, thinks about it in context especially of late modern warfare, that we must preserve the concept of murder and a strict prohibition on the killing of the innocent.
Well, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why, as many have noted, it takes a Christian world to produce a decent murder mystery.
Yeah. I hadn't thought to link those two things up, but I see it.
Yeah, and it's been done, precisely because of, for instance, the Murder Club, which included some of the very people we've mentioned here. Yes. Who gave themselves to the literary device. Chesterton involved in this, and so many others. Eventually, P.D. James, very much the successor to this, and in some ways is a more popular Iris Murdoch, in that P.D. James also works in fairly sophisticated. And by the way, more than one of these women used initials so that no one knew exactly what gender they were when they were making their early academic work.
Yeah, it's a convention in the British Academy, but not always for novelists. So yes.
Yeah. To me at least, I would argue that Anscombe and Murdoch have the most lasting, at least recognized significance. So what happens to the four of them in what we might say the afterlife of their philosophical contribution?
Yeah. Midgley becomes actually the most prominent public intellectual of the four of them. She doesn't start writing until she's raised her boys, and then she goes back to teaching and then starts writing and brings out the first of her 16 books.
Amazingly right.
Starting in her 1950s, starting in her 50s, in the late 70s. And so they're famous in different circles. Murdoch, the novelist, Anscombe and Foot together, I think, within the academy, about equally well known, though Anscombe is thought of as the greater. And Midgley is the public intellectual. But where do they leave us? Anscombe, Foot, and Murdoch, between them, create space within the academy to think differently than Ayer thought. They are the ones who open up other vistas, who level critiques at the dominant forms of Ayer and post-Ayer moral thought. But none of them really put together an ethics in a way that Midgley does. And so I'm especially admiring of this, how this late bloomer or late starter in the set is the one who thinks about what would this look like if it was more fully spelled out. Anscombe and Foot say things like, well, we should really return to the virtues. We should think more about the virtues. But it's not like they go Thomas Aquinas and give you the Secunda Secundae where you have a catalog of all the virtues. And that's not Midgley's approach either. But Midgley goes the furthest to say, let us think about a number of practical questions in life in light of this way of doing ethics.
Yeah. Okay, I need to ask you this question. So relate these four figures to the question of the existence of God and to the Christian intellectual tradition.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been thinking about this because you having me on, Bishop Barron writing an appreciative note about the book. The book is not apologetic. And yet I've been intrigued and pleased to see Christians thinking there's some affinity between what these women, three of whom are not believers,
right,
are doing and how we see the world. It's a book, I would say, about how much of a difference it makes the background pictures that you bring to everything else that you think and everything that you think about. And I think it is as natural as breathing for a Christian to be a moral realist, to think that goodness is objective. And so whether or not we're particularly drawn, as I'm drawn myself, to this Aristotle, Aquinas, virtue and vice way of thinking about ethics, nonetheless, the idea behind the idea that we need to get out of a picture in which this couldn't be true, in which the world is this pitiless, blank, valueless place, and putting ourselves in a fundamentally different kind of worldview in which we could imagine a moral reality. I think Christians see, oh yes, that moral imagination is something that we recognize and something that we are concerned to defend.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I do consider myself as a theologian also to have a responsibility as an apologist. But I think that has to come after engaging honestly, at least as honestly as possible, the thought and the structures of thought of the person with whom we're engaging. I think your book is phenomenally interesting and frankly kind of sets an interpretive grid for what had been a missing piece in the English-speaking intellectual tradition.
Thanks so much.
I think that's something exciting to me. Is finding. Okay, I knew these people existed. I've read especially Anscombe, and some Foot, and I it's just very, very helpful, and even the biographical sections are just very helpful. But I make a distinction in this thinking between two different categories that I find lacking sometimes in other apologetic thought. And that is, number one, the category of a Christian mind. And then secondly, a mind that still operates within many of the structures of Christian thought. And that's a distinction. And of course, you have those who actually are trying to be outside both of those categories, and some quite successfully so. But frankly, in this period in the English-speaking world, it was very difficult actually to operate outside the intellectual structures of the inherited Christian faith.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, we've mentioned Plantinga earlier
Yeah.
on. I'm thinking of how hard it was for him and Nicholas Walterstorff and other
Yeah.
Christian
Yeah.
philosophers coming into the academy at the beginning of their careers. They testify to this when they write memoiristically,
Yeah.
that they had to break down these clusters of assumptions that made the questions they wanted to ask, the things they wanted to say, unstatable.
Right.
And that's a service, that's an important work to do that's pre-apologetic.
Now, I have never done before in one of these conversations what I'm about to do now, because it's never been an occasion. So your book came out basically in the last year.
Yeah,
It's
about a year ago.
Copyright 2022. Again, the women are up to something. How Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Mary Midgley, and Iris Murdoch revolutionized ethics. Okay, so then more recently,
Yes.
Metaphysical Animals: How Four Women Brought Philosophy Back to Life by Claire McCumhall and Rachel Wiseman. Okay, what's the difference between these two books? This one came out after yours, I believe.
Yeah, just.
So, yeah, but how did you and the other authors know you were working on the same project?
Eventually we did. I got to know Rachel in 2015, 2016, when I was on one of my stints over in London teaching Houghton University's honors program. And we met for coffee. At the time, she and several collaborators, including Claire, were working especially on bringing out anthologies of these women's writing, but, toying with the idea of doing biographical writing. It wasn't clear at the time that they were already thinking that, but they had me up to a conference in Durham, and friends would be too strong. We don't see a lot of one another, but very friendly acquaintances. And then they decided, yeah, we want to write a book on this. So I think each of us was hoping that it wouldn't be destructive to the other one's work, that each of us was doing this, but each of us knew that we'd independently form the desire to tell this story. But they are different stories. I don't know if you've read Rachel and Claire's book yet.
Yeah, well, I want you to tell me how you see them as different.
Okay, theirs has a different set of chronological boundaries, and with that different scope, a different level of detail. That I do a childhood to death scope and am asking, what's the implicit philosophical project that emerges out of the work of these women? And Claire and Rachel are especially interested in formative years. They take us just up to 1957, just when Anscombe and Foot are about to start doing
a lot more detail during
that they're famous for, and it's hugely richly detailed. It's so intricate that if you want to take a deep dive into what was their experience like in the 40s and 50s, that Claire and Rachel are writing about 37 to 57 and writing with a kind of detail that I did not aspire to.
Yeah, no, I get that. And I did read their book. And I will say, again, by the way, I give them credit for a good title as well.
Yeah.
But, my thought in the two of these books coming out when they did, and again, I'm always kind of really intellectually curious and hungry when I find a question being asked about a period, about even an individual, or a period in an individual's thought where, all of a sudden some formative change has taken place that shapes the Western mind. But it reminded me, I've had one of these conversations with Peter Brown at Princeton, who is still writing in his 10th decade of life. And, he really developed the intellectual field of late medieval history, as a period of late medieval history. And he reshaped the entire intellectual, the way intellectual history is taught. Now you've got, editors who specialize in editing books on the late medieval era. And I have to wonder if something similar will be happening here. I'm just going to predict that I think these two books together, and yours first, are likely to set off some further discussion, which could also be fruitful.
I hope so. Yeah, it's been, you're worried when friends are in a kind of professional competition with you, or like there's something competitive about your projects. It's been a relief to them and to me that the books really are distinctive enough to do different kinds of work together. And I think it has, on the whole, been fruitful for both books to get reviewed together, each of them giving reason to editors to do a review of the other.
Yeah. Well, I was particularly intrigued by your book and the way you set out the narrative. And by the way, it's very helpful to me to have kind of birth to death covered here and their intellectual impact. I want to ask you one other question, Professor Lipscomb. So what are you up to now? What are you up to?
What am I up to?
Yeah, what are you up to?
Well, always teaching my classes, getting a group of students ready to go off to London with our honors program, as they do each spring. But in my scholarship, there's two things that intrigue me, especially right now. I don't know which one of them I'll pursue more or first. First, Richard Hare, this POW who is the kind of bête noire of these women throughout the early phases of their career. But I find him a very sympathetic figure in some ways, very interesting figure. And there's a pivot in his thought from the first things that he writes while he's a prisoner of war to the writings for which he becomes known, the writings that set him against these women and them against him. But I'm interested in what happened there. What were his thoughts at first and why did he change? He is someone, it seems to me, who falls under the influence of a prevailing intellectual culture, of a prevailing intellectual fashion, and turns away from what interests me about these women's work. And I think that's an interesting story in its own right. But then also, I got interested in writing this book about how much philosophy was part of the public conversation in Britain after World War II. The BBC has this highbrow channel, the Third program, that is broadcasting philosophy talks and philosophy discussions all the time, so that it's much more...
Hourly workers knew who Bertrand Russell was.
Yes. And what was happening there? Right. I'd like to... My working title is Philosophy on the Air, and there are rich resources for this. The BBC Written Archives have transcripts of all of this stuff. I think it could be a fun ensemble cast book, thinking about the rise and fall of public philosophy in Britain after the wars.
Professor Lipscomb, I can understand why students love being in your classes and going with you to study in London. So a curious mind and a disciplined mind draws other minds. And I really enjoyed your book. And if you write the one especially on philosophy on the air, sign me up for a conversation as soon as it comes out. Thank you for joining me today for Thinking in Public.
Thanks so much for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Many thanks to my guest, Benjamin Lipscomb, for thinking with me today. If you enjoyed today's episode of Thinking in Public, you will find more than 150 of these conversations at albertmohler.com under the tab Thinking in Public. For information on the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, go to sbts.edu. For information on Boyce College, just go to boycecollege.com. Thank you for joining me for Thinking in Public. And until next time, keep thinking.